it's hard to decide a license without really knowing in depth what each of them actually do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's tricky because a lot of people don't like those permissive licenses
Mm-hmm.
because of the freedom, because they're really focused on the freedoms of what the user can do with the code, whereas the licenses like the copyleft ones, like the GPL licenses, do a great job at ensuring the freedom of the code to all users in general. So it's really a balance of freedoms and where you lie on that. But the permissive licenses tend to have much simpler text, and they're usually a lot easier to read,
You're gonna
which
get
is why
you're definitely gonna get comments because you just referred to open source licenses as protecting freedoms. There's always people I have arguing with me every time I bring this up. Like people will say, "Oh, they're not protecting freedoms because they're free for the companies to abuse you." You know, when people have I have a lot of people who are very diehard free software people who will argue to the death that free software is the only correct way to license software and open source because of what companies are able to do with it. You know, when you have someone who is not willing to have a proper discussion about free software, there's gonna be some interesting arguments being made.
yeah, that always tends to come up because
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, you have different sets of freedoms, just
Yes.
different avenues for freedoms, and they're not always compatible. In a lot of the case, they aren't
Mm-hmm.
because you can't do something like the GPL, which is, as I said, great at making sure the code stays open,
Mm-hmm.
while also giving totality and freedom to people that want to do whatever they want and want to mix that code with whatever other code that they have.
Yes.
So yeah, you have to decide what freedoms are important to you. And on that note, with free software versus open source, that comes up a lot. But in practical terms, again, going by the FSF guidance, um, they're very similar in functional use. If
Mm-hmm.
you had a Venn diagram of them, they'll be pretty much overlapping, just with free software being slightly within the open source circle, in that all free software is classed as open source, but not all open source is classed as free software, with the
Right.
difference being fairly minor. And I don't have any examples to mind because I can't remember exactly where those come into play. But functionally, they're very similar, but with a very different philosophy and origins and backing, and that's where you can often get some contention.
Mm-hmm. Before we move on to another topic, I kind of want to ask you about, like, not the philosophies themselves, but about the terms free software and open source, because I've brought this up plenty of times myself. I feel like both of them are really bad terms and have a lot of really annoying baggage attached to them, because free software, most people, when they think of the term free, they think of monetarily free. And then open source has kind of, you have a lot of people that think, and this relates to the Futo thing, think open source just means source available.
Yeah, I don't blame anyone for thinking that. I mean, it's such these terms are so ubiquitous nowadays, especially to developers coming to here or anyone interested with open source projects in any way, that you make those assumptions. I think that's just natural because it will be some text say, "Hey, check out our open source project here." You go there, you see the code open, and you make that assumption. But realistically, I think that's a natural part of trying to get any kind of shorter branding,
Sure.
sexy term that summarizes a much wider thing, because you don't want to be quoting all 10 points of the open source
Sure.
definition every time you're talking about a project. So there's always going to be kind of that education piece to it. Um, and that's where I think some of the difficulties can lie in this part of trying to communicate, of kind of protecting that original term and educating on that, because yeah, when you come into it, you often are focused on the viewing or the using. Those are the important parts, and it's not really until you get deeper into it, until you're maybe choosing a license for your own project, or you spend enough time to see how these projects evolve over time, that you kind of see how important the other aspects of openness are and how those rules of the OSI stewarded open source definition come into play and how they protect the freedoms that it ensures. Because it's not open just based on viewing, because if someone steals the GTA 6 source code, puts that on GitHub, it's not really open source. I mean, you can get to it, you can view it, but you're essentially handling stolen goods at that stage, and so you certainly don't have permission to even see that.
Well, an example that's already happened is
the
Windows XP source code leaked a couple years ago, whenever it happened. Yeah, the Windows XP source code leaked. Like, that doesn't mean it's now open source. It's just the source. Like, this is the other problem, because you have source code that is available, you have source available, and then open source. All three of these categories are very different. Both source available and open source. These are code bases that have been licensed in a way that you're allowed to see that code, you're allowed to access that code, and depending on whether it's source available or open source, there's different things you're allowed to do with that code. In open source, you're allowed to derive work from that and things like that. But then there's source code, which is available, which is, all of those categories as well, but also leaked source code is part of that as well. And when you're looking at this from a non-technical user perspective, when you're someone who, especially if you're someone who doesn't have a programming background, you don't have a background in open source, all of these look very, very similar.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why I don't think we should necessarily go after people for using the wrong term, because there is that education piece, because I wouldn't have known that until getting into it. And as I said, there's always going to be that when you're shortening a term, but I do think it's important to defend a term. I mean, I guess the way that I see it is that a term like open source, it is up to the public, it is up to the community for how something like that is defined. And if everyone goes a different way, the OSI definition doesn't mean anything. But at the end of the day, I think that's only so ubiquitous now because of the efforts that have been built up around it, that have been built up to that definition, that have been built around publishing software under those terms. And it's still the case today. I see a lot of comments saying, oh, it's a lost cause, just give up on it and use something else. But I really don't agree, because I still see like 99.9% of the software that's put out there under a banner of open source still adheres to those essential core freedoms that the open source provides in viewing, use, modification, and distribution. So I think it's not worth just binning it up and giving it up because other people are trying to use it, because realistically that is quite a small percent. And even though a lot of people say, oh, we should use free software instead or Libre software, if it happens for open source, nothing's to say it just won't happen to those terms as well. Where there's value, where there's reputation, as there has been built up around open source from all the work that everyone's put into it, providing code under that definition, then people will want to use that for marketing, because it is a sexy term, especially for VC funded startups that are really trying to take every advantage they can. They want to have every banner, and it's open source is great for adoption. It's an amazing adoption driver, which everyone really wants to in their early stages. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one, but I think fundamentally kind of made a decision that it is worth trying to defend and educating about, because there always does need to be that kind of step with any kind of shortened term.
The numbers are kind of not properly tracked, but this is a GitHub blog post from 2015. According to those numbers, which I'm sure have changed since then, MIT was 44.69% of projects. 15% were other. I wish they properly explained what that other was and broke that down into a better category. Third place was GPL v2 at 12.96. Fourth place, Apache. Fifth place, GPL v3. And then sixth place, BSD3 clause. And then it's not until you get under that we start seeing things like unlicensed, which is only at 2%, but even so. Like, on a more recent numbers, it's MIT, Apache, GPL v3, MPL. MPL I don't think was around at the time, and then BSD3 clause. All of these, obviously GPL v3 is a free software license, but the rest of these are very much within the realm of what we define as an open source license.
And a lot of those are quite permissive as well, which is what you'd kind of expect on, especially on a platform like GitHub, where because permissive license are going to be way more useful for things like libraries, which you're going to have a lot more of in general than projects, which tend or are more likely to go down the copyleft route because it makes more sense at that higher level. And plus, yeah, as we said earlier, those permissive licenses are simpler, and I was certainly kind of less scared of those permissive licenses when coming into open source. So it's usually just an easy route to go to.